Number 10. West Virginia mother killer. In West Virginia, a woman has been charged with murder following the deaths of both her mother and sister. This diabolical woman allegedly staged their deaths to make it look as though their daughter killed the mother, then turned the gun on herself. It was an extremely elaborate scheme to get away with one of the worst crimes imaginable. It happened back in 2017, with the police originally convinced by the story that there was nobody else involved in the case except for the two dead people. It wasn't until later that they finally figured out Megan Hargan had set the whole thing up. She's responsible for the murder of her mother, Pamela, and her younger sister, Helen. She shot her mother in the head in the laundry room of their home, then blasted Helen in the upstairs bedroom. She might have gotten away with it too if she had staged the scene a little better. According to Fairfax County Police Major Ed O'Carroll, a hard look at the evidence proved the whole house had been set up to confuse the cops. He also called what happened domestic violence at its worst. As for why Megan turned on her mother and sister, a family friend told local news that Megan was very jealous. Her mother had purchased a home for her sister Helen while giving her nothing. She took her anger out on both of them in cold blood. Number 9. Internal demons. Chris Coleman was born into a community of evangelical Christians. His mother and father were preachers, meaning he spent his entire childhood being smothered by their way of thinking. When he entered high school, he became a normal teenager, going out and getting drunk and having fun. But being raised so hardcore Christian meant that he actually called his basketball coach and confessed that he had been drinking. In other words, he was a very conflicted individual. Chris grew up and met Sherry. Sherry got pregnant, and the two got married. But their marriage was doomed from the start. It's important to note that Chris was making a significant amount of money after they had their first child as head of security for a company. I'm talking at least $100,000 a year. This money changed Chris, made him cocky. He began to have an affair with Sherry's best friend from high school. The two became serious, and Chris began plotting how to get rid of his current wife. But like back when he was a teenager, his selfish desire clashed with his Christian upbringing. The scheme involved sending fake threats to himself. Chris lived beside a police detective named Justin Barlow with the Columbia Police Department. Chris sent himself threatening emails to try and make it look like somebody was interested in killing his entire family. Then on May 5, 2009, the detective received a call from Chris. Chris said he had been trying to reach his wife, but she wouldn't answer the phone. When Barlow went to do a welfare check, he found both Chris's children strangled to death in their beds, with Sherry also dead from strangulation. Of course, it was Chris that did it. All evidence pointed to him killing his own family, just so he can escape with his wife's best friend and start a new life. He was charged with all 3 murders and given life in prison. Number 8. Laundry Day. Shane Fennell shot his sister-in-law over a bad laundry day. At least, that's how Shane had described his own motive in the fatal shooting that just took place in Oregon. His sister-in-law, Alexandra, was completely innocent. Her only crime was her marriage to Shane's brother, Jordan. When the two brothers got into a fight over laundry, Shane got so angry that he threw a potted plant at his brother, pulled out a gun, and walked straight over to his brother's wife, where she sat on a patio chair. She had her back to him, looking across the yard in the other direction, and probably trying to ignore the brothers fighting. She never even knew she died. Shane held the gun to the back of her head and pulled the trigger, blowing her brains out in front of her face. There was really no escaping this for Shane. He killed her in front of a witness and did it in cold blood. When police arrested him, he told them, "I did a horrible thing." And yeah, he sure did. Something tells me there was more than laundry at play here. Perhaps Shane was actually jealous of his brother's wife. Number 7. An addicted son. A man has beaten his elderly mother to death with a stick. According to the report in Latin Times, the man beat his mother with a stick because she refused to give him money to purchase drugs. The woman was just 60 years old when her son, 38, showed up in the early hours of the morning begging for money. He was already a known drug addict. He had already gotten in trouble with his brother for picking fights with their mom, and police had already gotten reports before that he'd beaten the woman up. The addict's son went too far. Locals in the town heard screaming at 4:30 in the morning, but didn't bother reporting it to the police because it happened so frequently. It was the man's brother who came upon the scene just as he was finishing off the mother with the stick. He thrashed her until she stopped moving, and sadly, the other brother intervened too late. The police were eventually brought to the house, at which point the drug addict was carried away, later being charged with murder. Number 6. Turning on the spouses. In the year 1924, two residents of Illinois decided they were going to murder their own spouses so that they can be together. This was Elsie Sweeten and the Reverend Lawrence Height, a couple of adulterers who needed to get rid of their pesky spouses so that they could run away and be happy together. Their method of killing was arsenic. The Reverend poisoned his wife, Anna, and Elsie murdered her husband, Wilford. She gave Wilford chocolate candy mixed with poison. He became super sick, and the next day, she mixed more poison in with his oatmeal and fed that to him. The final dose was fed the day after the oatmeal, with a healthy helping of poison to his tomato soup. Amazingly, the pair almost got away with the crime. But in the small town of Ina, back in the 1920s, secrets weren't exactly easy to keep. People were quick to realize that the two were consorting with one another. The sheriff got involved, and the whole thing blew up in their faces. The sheriff actually had to pick them up and drive them out of town so they wouldn't get lynched. What do you think could push two people to commit such horrible crimes against their very own spouses? Do you think it's inherent evil or just the byproduct of some seriously sick minds? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. The Worst Brother. Julie Archer was 49 years old when she died from what had been described as horrific injuries. These injuries were the result of her brother, Stephen Archer, dousing her in a lethal mix of gasoline and mineral spirits inside her home. The mixture was made in a Pepsi bottle, what the prosecution in this case called an aggressively flammable liquid. While Julie was sitting on her sofa in the living room, Stephen emptied the bottle over her head and then ignited the vapor. Julie burst into flames and began to scream. At the time, her 19-year-old daughter was upstairs listening to the whole thing. She described the explosion as an earthquake, saying it literally shook the house. Julie, on fire and burning like a scarecrow, staggered outside and fell down in the front garden. Her daughter was trapped upstairs, choking on thick black smoke. And yet, even though she was almost already dead, Julie tried to drag herself back through the front door when she realized her daughter was stuck upstairs. But Julie just didn't have the strength. Luckily, her daughter managed to escape through the window and jumped out of the house. But let's go back to Stephen, who attempted to murder his own sister. There's no doubt that that's exactly what he was trying to do. He even wrote her a card while she was in the hospital, saying, "Karma has punished you through me." But she didn't get well in the hospital and died from her burns. Apparently, the whole reason for the vicious attack was that Stephen blamed Julie for the recent death of his father. Number 4. AR-15 and hammer. A man from Farmington has done something absolutely heinous. His name is Blake Thomas Maloney, just 26 years old. He's been charged with 3 counts of murder, one for his father, one for his mother, and one for his brother. If convicted, he'll be getting life in prison. It all began when the police received a call from somebody worried about her friend. Tracy Ann Maloney had gone to the house of her ex-husband to visit her sons, but never left. The friend was worried that something may have happened. When officers went to the residence to look, they found Blake Maloney inside, along with the corpse of Tracy, whom had been beaten to death with a hammer. He then placed a yoga mat over her face and let her bleed to death on the kitchen floor. Tracy was his mother. When the police searched the basement, they found Jack John Maloney dead and covered over with a blanket. He was killed by a gunshot wound to the head from when his own son, Blake, opened fire on him with an AR-15. And finally, 23-year-old Scott was also found dead from a gunshot wound to the head, Blake's own brother. Why did he do it? Blake Maloney turned out to be completely insane. He told investigators in an interview that he didn't believe those people were his family, so he murdered them. And that's it. He had no better excuse than that. He was just delusional and dangerous. Number 3. The Facebook Dad. A father in Canada killed off his entire family, one by one. He murdered his wife, his daughter, and his sister. And then to make things truly strange, he confessed everything he did in a bizarre Facebook post. His name is Randy Jansen, and his online friends were stupefied when an admission of homicide turned up on his Facebook wall. He admitted that he killed his daughter because she was suffering from severe migraines, and there was no end in sight for her pain. So, like a deer that you've accidentally hit with your car, Randy thought the best thing to do was put his daughter out of her misery. He did this with a bullet to her head while she wasn't looking. Then, to spare his wife the horror of knowing that her daughter was dead, he blasted her in the face too. The final victim of his murderous rampage was his sister, Shelley. He didn't want her living with the guilt and shame of knowing her brother was a murderer and that he'd killed her beloved niece. So, Randy drove to her home and shot her in the back of the head. Number 2. Maryland Triple Murder. In Maryland, Jeffrey Allen Burnham turned on his brother, attacked his sister-in-law, and also killed an elderly woman. Police officers originally discovered the body of Rebecca Reynolds in her home with obvious trauma. Someone had beaten the lady, 83 years old at the time of her attack, to death and then stole her 2020 Lincoln. The thief and murderer was Jeffrey. He did away with the lady just to get her car so he could drive to his brother and shoot him and his wife to death. Then, after making quick work of his brother and his brother's wife, he stole their 2007 Corvette and took off. Police were able to identify the bright red Corvette pretty easily. Jeffrey was taken into custody in just a few hours, and when they questioned him, it turned out Jeffrey was an absolute lunatic. He was furious at his brother, who was a pharmacist, for allegedly poisoning people with COVID-19 vaccines. Jeffrey was so angry at the government and at his brother for helping in the vaccine rollout that he betrayed nearly 50 years of brotherhood. All family values went out the window, and his own crackpot theories led him to murder, then straight to jail. And number 1, a man gone crazy. A judge has sentenced Ronnie O'Neal to 3 consecutive life sentences, with an additional 90 years tacked on for good measure. He described what Ronnie O'Neal did as the worst case he had ever seen in 19 years as a judge. Ronnie is responsible for murdering his girlfriend and then turning on their own kids. In fact, his own son testified against him at the murder trial. From what was made clear at the trial, Ronnie murdered his own daughter, Ronavea, who just so happened to be special needs and unable to talk. But first, he murdered his girlfriend, Ronavea's mother, right in front of her. Because his daughter was special needs, she couldn't scream. She couldn't get away. She couldn't do anything. She was totally helpless as her father bashed her in the face with a hatchet until she was dead. And all the while, his son was watching in utter horror and disbelief. Then Ronnie turned on his own son, but luckily didn't manage to finish the job before police and firefighters were on the scene. In the end, his son lived, but his daughter was gone forever. This was one of the most brutal attacks a parent perpetrated against their own kid that I've honestly heard of. Number 10. Shooting in the bathroom. On April 12, 2021, a police officer in Tennessee walked into a bathroom at Austin East Magnet High School and shot a teenager to death. 17-year-old Anthony J. Thompson Jr. was killed by a cop at school, the one place teenagers expect to be safe. It all started because police received a call from Anthony's ex-girlfriend's mother, claiming Anthony had been physically abusing her daughter. This is a very serious allegation, and so 4 officers responded to the school to see what Anthony had to say. When they got there, he was loitering in the bathroom, so the officers went to make the arrest. As they handcuffed the young man, the gun in Anthony's pocket went off and a bullet struck a trash can. But the sound of the gunshot caused such a mass confusion in the small bathroom that Officer Claybo pulled out his gun and shot the teenager, who then collapsed dead on the floor. But listen to how incompetent this police officer is. Not only did he get spooked by a gunshot and immediately shoot the teen who was already in handcuffs, he also shot another officer. After Anthony had been shot and collapsed, Officer Claybo fired again and struck another officer in the leg. Then they wasted time arresting a student who had barricaded himself in the stall because he was terrified instead of tending to Anthony. It took them over a minute to realize the teenager had even been shot. And in case you were wondering, no criminal charges are to be filed against the officer. Number 9. One jealous cop. An officer who had been with the San Antonio Police Department for 3 years was put on administrative leave in April of 2019. The reason was simple. Nicolette Muniz was arrested on suspicion of assault and family violence and subsequently charged. The incident happened at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Friday when Nicolette got into a dispute with her boyfriend. She learned that her boyfriend had been sleeping with another woman on the side. Although, to be honest, it was a little confusing on whose boyfriend this guy was. He definitely had a romantic relationship with both of them, but wasn't technically with Nicolette at the time of the attack. You see, Nicolette had called Kenneth Marino, but his other girlfriend picked up the phone instead. The 2 women got into an argument. Nicolette said, "I bet you won't say that to my face," and the other woman gave out her home address. This resulted in Nicolette showing up outside the woman's home at 3 o'clock in the morning. She wasn't messing around either. As soon as the woman came out, she beat the snot right out of her. The charges were eventually dropped against Nicolette, but she was given a no-contact order with her ex-boyfriend and told by her department to stay away from him. Number 8. The lingerie policewoman. Samantha Sepulveda lived a pretty busy life. She has over 100,000 Instagram fans and also happens to be a police officer in Freeport, Long Island. She's 5'2", full brunette, and so hot that she says criminals aren't mad at all when she's the one who arrests them. She even says she almost never has to get into a fight with perps, and instead just convinces them to put on the cuffs. Samantha claims her good looks and curves make her job easier because there's less aggression and dangerous situations are more easily diffused. Samantha began her modeling career in 2013 and has traveled all over the world to do photo shoots. It was only 3 years earlier that she had become a policewoman. In a news interview, Samantha recalled one time when she was phoned to deal with a man who had just beaten up his wife and threatened to kill the police. When Samantha started chasing him, the man was so overwhelmed by her beauty that he stopped, allowed her to arrest him, and then even asked her out on a date. Maybe if we had more cops like Samantha, the world would be a better place. Number 7. Taking a bribe. Officer Michael Mosley, or rather, ex-Officer Michael Mosley, was indicted by a federal grand jury on 2 counts of bribery. According to United States Attorney Matthew Schneider, the dirty cop took $15,000 in bribes. Michael had been on the force for 2 decades, but it all started going downhill in April of 2019. This was when Michael was a member of the Major Violators Unit. On April 3rd, he performed a search of a drug trafficker's residence. During the search, he discovered a heap of heroin and cocaine, as well as half a dozen firearms. The drug trafficker confessed that he had even more drugs where that came from, and even signed a confession. But what's weird was that Michael stayed in contact with the drug trafficker afterwards, and the trafficker didn't go to jail. You see, the dealer offered $15,000 in cash to not pursue drug charges. On May 2nd, Michael Mosley collected $10,000 in cash that had been left by the drug dealer in the backyard of some abandoned house in Detroit. Then on May 23rd, the officer took another $5,000. In return, Michael handed the original copy of the signed confession over to the drug trafficker, officially letting him go. Each bribery charge carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in jail. It's doubtful the officer is going to get 20 years in prison after serving on the force for 2 decades, but he's definitely getting fired and his career is over. All over a bit of extra cash. Number 6. Inappropriate photos and the Utah cop. A cop in Utah kept explicit photographs of a victim who was being extorted, showed them off to his buddies to get a laugh, and then the victim was murdered. Lauren McCluskey was a 21-year-old student at the University of Utah when she went to the campus police in October of 2018. Lauren was afraid of her ex-boyfriend, a 37-year-old sex offender named Melvin Rowland. Melvin had threatened to release extremely inappropriate and embarrassing photographs of Lauren if she refused to do what he said, and she had already paid him over $1,000 not to do it. She went to Officer Miguel Darras with her problem, and he saved the explicit images that were being used to blackmail Lauren on his cell phone. According to the investigation following Lauren's death, the officer showed them to at least one male colleague. He even bragged that he was able to look at Lauren's photos at any time he wanted. Clearly, the officer had no business being in any position of authority. He was a total dirtbag. Plus, 9 days after Lauren went to the campus cop for help, getting none, she was shot and killed by her ex. Her parents filed a $56 million lawsuit against the police for the way they handled this case. Lauren's mother says the very people who were supposed to help and protect her daughter instead exploited her and allowed her insane ex-boyfriend to murder her. Number 5. Stealing a corpse. On November 1st, 2021, something so insane happened that you would think it came straight from a Hollywood movie. A police officer in New Jersey struck and killed a man while driving down Garden State Parkway. Rather than calling it in and dealing with the situation, he picked up the body, put it in his car, and then drove away. Yeah, he stole the corpse of the person he had run over instead of taking them to the hospital or calling for a paramedic. The officer is Luis Santiago, and he was just 25 years old when he became a murderer. He was driving on the shoulder of the road at 3 o'clock in the morning when he hit Damian Dimka. The cop and his passenger, a male named Albert, left the scene, then drove back a little later and loaded the victim into the car. They didn't alert any other police or even try giving first aid. At the time, Luis Santiago was off duty. The 2 men drove to Luis's parents' house to discuss with the rest of the family what they should do with the body. But because Luis's father is a Newark police lieutenant, he set things straight. He forced his son to go back to the scene of the crime, and he called the police and ratted him out. His own father tattled. Luis had only become an official cop 2 years earlier in 2019. He has since been suspended without pay and is facing charges of desecrating human remains, vehicular homicide, leaving the scene of a crash, and endangering an injured victim. Plus, his passenger and his mother are being charged with conspiracy. Number 4. Planting drugs. A former Florida deputy was indicted for supposedly planting drugs during a traffic stop. Zachary Wester, who had been a deputy in Jackson County, took a bit of a career tumble in 2018 after these allegations came into the light. He was indicted in 2019 on 52 counts, including misconduct, racketeering, fabricating evidence, and false imprisonment. This is because he didn't get busted just planting drugs on one unwary driver, but roughly a dozen, and those are only the ones that came forward. Most of his cases come from traffic stops in 2017 and 2018. The officer arrested drivers and passengers alike and charged them with possession of methamphetamine and marijuana. But after many of these people came forward to say it was complete nonsense, the police had no choice but to look at it seriously. One of his victims was a mother who had been pulled over because one of her brake lights was broken. Wester then stashed a couple bags of meth in her vehicle and arrested her for felony possession and child endangerment. Zachary Wester arrested so many people on false drug charges that there were just no way the department could keep it quiet. They were forced to start investigating in 2018, even though they almost certainly knew what he was doing all along. He has since pleaded not guilty, although over 120 defendants arrested by Wester have had their charges dropped and been set free. Clearly, the people in charge know exactly what he was doing. Some of the people Wester arrested on fake drug charges went to jail for upwards of a year. One man he falsely arrested for meth possession, Chris Fears, lost his job, he and his wife split up, and his life fell apart because everyone thought he was a meth addict, when in fact it was just a really evil police officer who had nothing better to do than ruin people's lives. Number 3. Robbing a Marine. Stephen Lara is a Marine from Texas who was robbed by the DEA and had to sue them to get his money back. It happened in February of 2021. Stephen was on his way to visit his daughters in North California when he took out his entire life savings from the bank in cold hard cash. He had possession of $87,000 stuffed in bags in his car, but he wasn't worried because that was his money. Well, a Nevada State Highway Patrol officer pulled Stephen over because he was driving too slowly. When the officer looked in his vehicle, he saw the bags of cash. The officer was immediately suspicious, but Stephen denied it had anything to do with illegal activity. It didn't. Nevertheless, a DEA agent was called in to seize the cash. Even though Stephen wasn't charged with a crime, the DEA was still able to seize his money as part of an ongoing investigation. What this means is that even if the police suspect you may have committed a crime, or were intending to commit a crime, they can take your stuff and never give it back. But in this case, the incident went viral. Stephen happened to be a combat veteran who served his country in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he wasn't about to let the DEA steal his entire life savings. He sued them, and they immediately turned over the money to avoid any further embarrassment. Number 2. Drunk off duty. Ashley Hunter is an officer with the Miami Police, but she got into some serious trouble in May of 2021 when she got busted driving drunk. According to her arrest report, Ashley crashed her car on a Tuesday, and she was so drunk when officers showed up that her eyes were bloodshot and watery, and she could barely talk. Ashley refused to take a sobriety test and had to be hauled off to the hospital for minor injuries. After she was released from the hospital, she was taken into custody, then bonded out of jail almost immediately. But here's the part that's really going to bug you. Ashley was busted quite obviously drunk while driving, yet she was given a paid vacation. Ashley was put on leave with pay while an investigation was carried out into her behavior. And last we heard, absolutely nothing has come of the supposed investigation, and Ashley hasn't been fired. And number 1, stealing human ashes. A man in Illinois is suing the city of Springfield following a terrifying and traumatic incident with 6 of its police officers. It happened during a traffic stop on April 6, 2020. Dartavius Barnes was pulled over by a cop for speeding and running a stop sign. Okay, that's his fault. But the police officer claimed his vehicle had been involved in a shooting and had a bullet hole in it. So, the cops had Barnes exit the vehicle and put him in handcuffs, then sat him in the back seat of his patrol cruiser. 5 more officers showed up to the scene, even though there was nobody there except Barnes, and was very secured in the back of a cruiser. They proceeded to pour through his car like a bunch of vultures, and at one point, an officer picked up a sealed urn, a small brass object that the officer immediately assumed contained narcotics. The officer unsealed the brass urn, claiming it looked like powdered ecstasy inside. The police told Barnes that they had tested the substance found in the urine and that it came back positive for drugs, either ecstasy or meth. But of course, none of this was true. The urine contained the ashes of his dead 2-year-old daughter. The officer was caught on video lying through his teeth. He didn't test anything. He just assumed that the substance was drugs, not human ashes. The officers desecrated Barnes' daughter's ashes, and now he's suing the city. They're scheduled to go to court in August of 2022.
10. Taking out a hit on the mother-in-law. In 2021, Lee Ann Bauman, a realtor and mother from Missouri, tried to hire a hitman to kill her ex-husband's mother, allegedly. Her trial is scheduled for sometime in 2022, so she hasn't technically been proven guilty yet. She has, however, been charged with conspiracy to commit murder. She supposedly plotted with a hitman to have her mother-in-law appear as though she had gotten into a fatal accident. Why? All because Lee was convinced the mother-in-law was causing unnecessary strain in her relationship with her daughters. Lee is a world record power boater from the Ozarks who was prepared to pay $1,500 to have the hit taken out on her mother-in-law. She was quoted as telling a friend that she knew murder was wrong as a Christian, but could simply go to church and ask for forgiveness when everything was said and done. We're not sure if that's how it works, but Lee certainly believed her soul would be cleansed in the end. According to documents from the court proceedings, Lee was worried that her ex-spouse and his mom were preparing to take her to court. She believed they were plotting to take her children away from her. And in that way, you can almost sympathize with Lee. She was desperate not to lose her kids, and so she went to some pretty ridiculous lengths to keep them. But her plan unraveled when her friend contacted a lawyer about the hitman, who then alerted the police. Even though she didn't actually pay anyone to do anything, the fact that she was trying was enough to get her locked up. 9. The murderous grandmother. On February 11, 2014, a grandmother shot her son-in-law in his home. She has since been sentenced to spend the next 50 years in prison by the Vista Superior Court. Considering Cynthia Sabaco was already 65 years old when she was put into custody, it doesn't look like she'll ever see the light of day again. But let's back things up a bit. On February 11th in California, about 8 o'clock in the morning, Cynthia should have been celebrating her 63rd birthday. Instead, she went to the house of her 53-year-old son-in-law, furious about some mean comments he had made about her to some other family members. She went into his apartment, ambushed him as he held a basket of laundry, and emptied her gun. But wait, it gets even more brutal. Cynthia unloaded her pistol into this guy, then went back to her car for more bullets, and returned to the apartment to shoot him again. The grandmother then went for some bacon and eggs at a local diner, ditched the gun at a nearby casino, and was apprehended by detectives while having a late afternoon coffee. 8. A controversial murder case. A woman in China, identified by court documents as Feng, was married for 6 months when she became the victim of a violent beating. On January 31, 2019, at just 22 years old, she was brutally killed by her husband and her in-laws. The reason behind the killing was that she had been unable to conceive a child. After 6 months of no baby, the husband and his parents were so angry that they bludgeoned this poor, innocent woman like a bunch of rabid demons. But that's not all. During court proceedings in Shandong, it was revealed that the woman's husband and his parents had also abused her. They wouldn't give her any food, they left her outside in the freezing cold like a dog, and finally finished things off with a deadly assault. It was one of the worst cases of in-laws gone wrong in recent memory. Here's where things got very controversial in China. The husband and the in-laws were only sentenced to 2 years in prison. They were given lenient punishments because they confessed all the relevant facts of the crime. Basically, the court said since they told the truth, they wouldn't get into trouble. But this caused nationwide fury. The public erupted so angrily that a retrial was called. However, there's been no news on what happened with the retrial. Right now, it looks like this was just said to calm the public down, and nothing is actually being done. 7. Death over exotic birds. After Pat Brown had a near-death experience, he started adopting and collecting exotic birds. It made Pat happy, and she really found solace in being surrounded by all of her nice birdies. Her husband, on the other hand, well, he didn't quite understand or appreciate the birds slowly filling up the house. Pat's husband, Fred, didn't like the birds one bit. The couple had been married for 20 years, but the birds just proved to be too much. It drove a wedge between the pair, ruining their relationship and resulting in murder. Pat suffered from high blood pressure and had to undergo open heart surgery in the year 1990. She healed up at her mother's house in Alabama for several months after. And even though her strength returned and she got better, she was never really the same. She ended up breeding between 50 and 60 exotic birds in her house. Fred may have hated it, but he didn't want to get a divorce, and he tried his best to be at peace. On the morning of April 25, 1991, Fred Brown was found dead on the side of Highway 68, next to an abandoned car. He had been shot 3 times, execution style. In the police investigation that followed, the cops immediately suspected Pat. People close to the couple admitted Pat had been verbally abusive to her husband. However, she had a rock-solid alibi. 3 years after the murder, police in Pennsylvania cracked the case. They had been given a letter written by the estranged husband of Pat's sister, or Fred's brother-in-law. He admitted to being hired by Pat to get rid of her husband. Pat had wanted the insurance money to buy a bigger house so she could breed more birds. The killer's name was Leroy Wenzel. He had given the letter to his daughter only to be read in the case of his death, but she read the letter anyway and then gave it to the police. As it turned out, Leroy had agreed to kill his distant brother-in-law for $30,000, and Pat had orchestrated the whole thing. 6. A foursome of killers. A woman was killed by her daughter-in-law in January of 2014. She was 80 years old at the time when she was brutally beaten and stabbed by Diana Nadell. Diana and 3 other women from across the country have all been charged in connection to the murder. This is a weird case. First of all, the victim's name is Peggy Nadell. Her son is married to Diana. Diana committed the murder with Andrea Benson of Washington, D.C., whom she hired specifically to do the heavy lifting. Here's how it all went down. Diana planned the killing in advance, motivated by Peggy's $4 million estate. She was hoping to get half of that estate money immediately, since the old woman was living much longer than she had hoped. She met Andrea Benson on January 24, 2014. Then they traveled to Peggy's home together, went inside, and dragged her down the stairs into the basement. There, the 2 women worked together to kill a woman in her 80s. It was despicable and terrible, and both women were given sentences to match their crimes. Andrea Benson was given 20 years to life, while Diana was given 23 years. 5. The Sleepwalker Killer. Kenneth Parks killed his mother-in-law in May of 1987. He was acquitted of the killing because he claimed he did it while sleepwalking and wasn't technically responsible. Yet this is some pretty intense sleepwalking. Kenneth drove 14 miles to the house of his mother-in-law, beat her with a tire iron, and then stabbed her until she was dead, all while fast asleep. He also tried to kill his father-in-law, but was thwarted before he could deliver the final blow. It was all very awful. There aren't really any other words to describe it. Barbara Woods never in a million years thought she would wake up in the middle of the night to see her daughter's husband standing over her with a weapon. When Barbara's husband tried to intervene, he was stabbed and strangled. Afterward, when Kenneth finally snapped out of his sleeping state, he fled to a police station and admitted what he believed he had done. Here's what was said in court. Doctors testified at the trial that there have been at least 30 cases of murder committed by people sleepwalking. Remember, this was in the 80s. Who knows how many people could have killed someone in their sleep since then? The doctors went on to say Kenneth would have been able to drive 14 miles while in a sleep state, then violently attack somebody. When asked what could have triggered such violence, it was attributed to stress. Kenneth was stressed because he was addicted to gambling and had recently embezzled $28,000. He also had a family history of sleepwalking and had been caught on at least 2 other occasions. In the end, Kenneth was acquitted on the murder charge. However, his personal life became pretty rough. Even if you kill someone by accident in your sleep, people still look at you like a murderer. 4. A recently purchased gun. Frederick J. Clea has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He killed his wife and his mother-in-law on a lazy Saturday afternoon in Pennsylvania, 2020. According to the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office, the victims are Latia Clea and her mom, Mackinda Saunders. When the police were called to the home due to reports of gunfire, Frederick answered the door. He admitted what he had done, and the cops found both women dead inside the house. It was terrible and tragic, and had to do with an argument Frederick and his wife were having. But here's where things get spooky. Frederick knew he was going to do something crazy. The police investigation learned that he had recently purchased a Glock, right after he and his wife had started fighting. Plus, Joe Saunders, whose sister and mother were murdered, said he had recently gotten a phone call from his mom asking for information. She wanted to know his social security number because he was finishing up her will. Clearly, the mother-in-law felt something terrible brewing. At the time of the shooting, it was the 4th homicide in Montgomery County since the beginning of the pandemic. Authorities were dealing with a huge uptick in domestic violence ever since people got shuttered inside their houses. It looks like Frederick just couldn't take it anymore, and being cooped up led him to do something he could never come back from. 3. Tired of his mother-in-law. A woman in New Jersey was beaten to death by her son-in-law in a terrible and unforgivable act of violence. Her name was Barbara Ann Bizzoni. She was discovered unresponsive with several injuries at her home 2 days after the assault started in December of 2021. It was her killer, James Pica, who phoned the police and confessed the crime. The attack began 2 days prior, then continued off and on for 48 hours, until James finally realized he had made a huge mistake and turned himself in. The grimy details of why and how this all unfolded are extremely unsettling. James told the police that he was angry, exhausted, and fed up with being the sole caretaker of his 84-year-old mother-in-law. James lived with his husband and his husband's mom and had to take care of both of them. He was the sole provider in the house, and he just snapped. He hit the old woman in the head, she fell to the floor, and then he kicked her. She was in such a bad place already that he didn't know what to do and simply worked himself into a frenzy. For 2 days, he beat her mercilessly while his husband cried and begged for him to stop. It was only when she was in her final moments of life that he called the police. 2. No personal space. A man in Missouri had a fairly similar experience to the evil killer we just talked about, James Pica. He was also sick and tired of his in-laws, but instead of beating up an old woman, he went on an insane killing spree. His name is Jesse Wee, and he's been charged with 3 counts of murder. At the end of March 2021, he shot and killed his wife, her mother, and her stepfather, Tanya Wee, Linda Kohler, and Ronald Kohler. According to the Greene County Sheriff's Office, Jesse called dispatch admitting that he had just shot 3 people, and then calmly explained why. Jesse told the 911 dispatcher he had been waiting over a week for his in-laws to leave his house. They showed up and started squatting with Jesse and his wife, and he absolutely hated it. He continuously told his in-laws to leave, but they wouldn't. They just kept coming. They were sleeping over and had basically moved in. When it became clear Jesse was in an impossible situation, he decided to kill everyone. There were definitely some better ways he could have solved his problem, but that's what he did. Jesse's family is now dead, and he's going to jail for the rest of his life. 1. Covering up a murder. In September of 2016, Carolyn Della Rose Nielsen from Adelaide in Australia may or may not have murdered her mother-in-law and then tried to cover it up with a fake home invasion. When the police arrived at the scene of the crime, they found the victim dead in the laundry room and her daughter-in-law hysterical in the driveway. Caroline told neighbors and police that they had been the victims of a home invasion, but the evidence said otherwise. Prosecutors said the smartwatch Myrna was wearing put her time of death differently than her daughter's timeline of events. They could see from the watch that immediately after she disconnected from the Bluetooth of her vehicle and walked into her house, there was a spike in activity and then her heart stopped. This didn't fit in with what Caroline said. Caroline claimed 2 or 3 men broke into their house, tied them up, beat Myrna to death, and then escaped. Yet they didn't steal anything. It just didn't really make sense. What's crazy is that Caroline got away with murder, if she was indeed responsible. There were 2 trials. The first was inconclusive, and the second went on for 6 weeks. In the end, the jury deliberated for 3 days, but found Caroline not guilty of murder. They couldn't reach a guilty verdict on the charge of manslaughter, and so the whole thing was dropped. What's the craziest situation you've ever had with an in-law? Let us know all about it in the comments, and thanks for watching. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for more awesome videos from the channel. Bye.